Okay, let's talk about this poem's form. Mending Wall by Robert Frost. The first thing I've seen students discuss or write down in their reading log is that they ask the question, why is this one long stanza? Well, there might be a variety of reasons, but just if you look at the poem itself, I can make the argument. The poem's called Mending Wall. I think you can make the argument that the one large stanza has the appearance of a wall. It has no breaks in it, right? And the line length all seems very, very similar. And one way, it just, if you look at it compared to the other poems that we read in class, I mean, you can draw a line straight down here, and it's essentially most of the lines, or most of the poem's lines, go to that distance. That's just a visual, right? But we want to explore it a little closer. When we read poetry, one thing to think about is the meter of the poetry, or the rhythm of the poetry. And one way to track that is to count syllables in a line. And what we will find if we do that with this poem is that this poem, and we can look this up, that this poem is actually iambic pentameter. Whoops. And what this means is an iamb is a metric foot that is comprised of an unstressed and stressed syllable. All right, that's what an iamb is. All right, an iamb has both of these things. And so if you look at this, that's one syllable, and that's a second syllable. So an iamb has two syllables in it, and penta means 5. So quick math, it's English class, but if an iamb has 2 syllables and we have 5 iambs, holy moly, we should have 10 syllables. All right. And if we look at this, and one way to track stress versus unstressed and syllables are these little lines right here. Some thing. And if we look at something, unstressed would be the sum. Think about what you emphasize, where you stress in saying that word, something. And so the thing is what's stressed. There is that doesn't love let me think here. Let me go back, sorry. All right, so we have something, there is, that doesn't love a wall. And so we have 10. We should have 10 syllables, 10 little lines, and the little cup is unstressed. The line means it's stressed. And figuring out what's stressed and unstressed can be difficult, and it has a lot to do with how we pronounce certain things. And sometimes iambic pentameter it's not perfect, okay? But we do see 10 syllables here. We'll see it again in the next line too. That sends the frozen ground swell under it. All right, again, another 10 syllable line. And we'll see that most of these lines have 10 syllables and follow iambic pentameter. Notice though, when we talk about iambic pentameter, we're not actually talking about rhyme, right? Because we have wall, we're not talking about end rhymes at least. We have it, we have sun, we have abreast, we have thing, we have repair. None of these things rhyme. And so what that's called is blank verse. And blank verse simply means that it's an iambic pentameter, but there's not end rhymes. All right, so Robert Frost is actually working really hard with this form throughout the poem. That's one thing to think about when it talks about the form, but he does a lot here. One of the first lines that we have that's not 10 syllables is, and I don't have these lines. Oh yeah, I do. Line 8. All right. But they would have the rabbit out of hiding. That's 11. All right, that's 11 syllables here. And so we see that this form, although it holds true for the first 7 lines, in line 8, it breaks. And you have to start asking yourself, okay, we're working within this form, and yet we're breaking the form. Why are we breaking the form? In what ways does breaking the form influence the content or inform the content of the poem? One thing, I mean, you know, and we have to talk about the content of the poem, which we're not going to do in this video, but think about this line, line 8. This line is about getting a rabbit out of hiding, something slipping out of rocks, and scampering away. And I would argue that the form emphasizes this. I mean, the syllable kind of slips out of the form. The form itself, the rock wall itself, cannot contain all these syllables. Like the wall itself cannot contain this rabbit. The rabbit ends up slipping out of hiding from the wall. And so we see a little bit there, if we want to think like that, of how the form and breaking this 10-syllable line influences the content of the poem, which is the rocks of the wall being set aside in order to get a rabbit out of hiding. All right. Another thing, so now that we start thinking about this, there's a lot of things he does, Frost does, with the form. Look at these lines. These are 5-syllable lines, but think if you have 5-syllable lines, we know that there's not a middle point in 5 syllables because it's an even number. So you can do it, if you want to find the middle, you can have 4, and you can have 4, but you're going to have 2 in the middle in terms of syllables. In both of these lines, we have the word between, which separates the two sides. It's a 2-syllable word, right? But the word between comes in both and comes right in the middle. And the word between actually becomes something between the word bifurcates the line, or splits the line into 2. Between almost it becomes wall-like. Whoops, I ran out of room there. Wall-like. Does that make sense? I mean, I hope it does. I know it's a video, but I hope that makes sense, how that's working. Look at this line, line 16. To each the boulders that have fallen to each. We have the phrase to each on both sides of this line, emphasizing, look, if these are people, and this poem and the lines indicate the wall or space. I mean, we have one person here. That's a little stick figure if you can't see that. And a person here. The phrase to each being on both sides of that line, and what's between it? Boulders, right? But we have separation of each person. So, and that's what this poem's about, is the separation between individuals, right? And we see it within the form, all right? We'll look at one more, or maybe we'll look at two more. I know we're running out of time here. I don't know if this poem or this video will condense, but look at line 18. We need a spell to make them balance. Here's another 11-syllable line. We have to use a spell to make them balance. All right. And don't say, well, he just couldn't make 11. He couldn't make it 10 syllables. All these are easily changed. We could just say, we could take out we have to and say we both use a spell to make them balance. Then we have 10 syllables, right? I mean, there's a way to make this 10 syllables. This is purposely not 10 syllables. But if you look at this line, spell is right in the middle. And spell, in a sense, because remember we were talking earlier that with 10 syllables you can't have one syllable line right in the middle. In this sense, spell, we have spell, and it allows there to be 5 syllables on one side and 5 syllables on another. And the word spell itself actually balances out this line. And so we have a nice balance, and it's balanced by the word spell. But at the same time, the line doesn't fit the iambic pentameter because it's 11 syllables. And I think this kind of contradiction and tension between things balancing and yet not fitting a structure is a tension that we'll see in the content of the poem. The last thing I want to talk about is both times that we get the neighbors speaking about good fences and good neighbors, both times. This is 11 syllables. So this line is talking about the content is the value of tradition. All right? But the form belies that message because it's broken. And that the content says, hey, the neighbor says, good fences make good neighbors. And how do I know that? Well, my dad taught me that, right? But this form of iambic pentameter is also something that's passed down from generation to generation. And this is something that doesn't hold true when we try to perpetuate the tradition of good fences make good neighbors. And one way to look at this is one cliche, like good fences make good neighbors, contradicts other cliches. I mean, just right off the top of my head, I can think of love thy neighbor, right? I mean, is that not a saying as well? So we have these traditional aspects that conflict with one another. So as we hold on to one, we actually are turning our back on another. And I think that's another place where we have tension between kind of tradition versus a new way of thinking, or the strength of tradition and the weakness of tradition. And we can see this through the form. I hope this makes sense. And we can talk about this in class.